Washington, D.C., May 15, 1911. The Supreme Court of the United States just dropped 20,000 words of legal dynamite on the most powerful man in the world. For the first time in American history, a private corporation had been declared unreasonable, not fined, not slapped on the wrist, executed. The court ordered the total dismantlement of Standard Oil, a machine that controlled 90% of the world's oil supply. Every barrel, every pipeline, every lamp burning in every American home. But John D. Rockefeller wasn't in a courtroom. He wasn't on the phone with lawyers. He was on a golf course. He was 72 years old, a gaunt, skeletal figure. Alopecia had stripped every hair from his body, leaving him with parchment skin and a silver wig that sat slightly wrong. He looked less like a tycoon and more like something that had crawled out of a Victorian nightmare. As he lined up his putt, a breathless messenger broke the silence. The octopus had been decapitated. Standard Oil was being shattered into 34 pieces. His playing partner, a local priest, watched him, waiting for some kind of reaction. Rage, grief, anything. Rockefeller didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He adjusted his stance, tapped the ball, watched it drop, and whispered 3 words: "Buy Standard Oil." Because here's the thing the world didn't understand yet, and Rockefeller did. Those 34 shattered pieces, companies we now know as Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, they were about to be worth far more separated than they'd ever been together. The punishment doubled his net worth almost overnight. In today's money, we're talking somewhere north of $400 billion. More than Bezos, more than Musk, more than anyone in recorded history. The government thought they'd killed him. They'd accidentally made him a god. So, how does a man get there? How do you build something so unstoppable that even the Supreme Court of the United States can't bring it down? And trying to only makes you richer. It starts, like most terrifying things, in childhood. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 into a household that functioned less like a family and more like a psychological experiment. On one side, his father, William "Big Bill" Rockefeller. The man was a flamboyant, silver-tongued con artist who disappeared for months at a time. In one town, he posed as a botanic physician, selling colored water as a miracle cancer cure. In another, he had an entirely separate secret family. When Big Bill did come home, he didn't bring warmth. He brought lessons. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," he once boasted with a grin. "I want to make 'em sharp." He'd lure his sons into handshake deals, trick them out of their pocket money, then laugh when they fell for it. He was deliberately, methodically teaching young John that the world was predatory, that even your own blood would pick your pocket if you blinked. On the other side, his mother, Eliza, Baptist, iron-willed, a woman who treated a wasted penny as a moral failure. Her mantra, "Willful waste makes woeful want," became the ticking clock inside John's head. The result? A boy who learned simultaneously to trust no one and waste nothing. By age 7, while other kids played in the dirt, John was running a turkey business. He tracked every grain of corn the birds ate, every hour of labor, every cent of profit. He had a small red notebook, Ledger A, and he audited his own childhood before he could shave. At 16, he landed his first real job, junior bookkeeper at a Cleveland merchant firm. 50 cents a day. But the money wasn't the point. John worked from dawn until the gas lights flickered at midnight, not just checking numbers, studying them, learning how credit moved, how debt strangled the weak, how commerce actually bled. He wasn't just learning accounting. He was building something in his mind, a system. And one day, he was going to impose it on the world. In 1859, the earth in Titusville, Pennsylvania, started bleeding black. Edwin Drake struck oil, and what followed was a madness that made the California gold rush look organized. Thousands of men descended on the hills. Shantytowns erupted overnight. Fortunes were made in a week and lost in a day. It was mud, fire, and total anarchy. Rockefeller watched from his desk in Cleveland with an expression of cold disgust. To a man raised on Ledger A, chaos wasn't exciting. It was offensive. And then he noticed something everyone else had missed. The real money wasn't in drilling. Drilling was a lottery. You might hit a gusher, you might hit a dry hole, and either way you were at the mercy of the earth. The real power was in the bottleneck, the refining, the gate every barrel had to pass through before it could become light or heat or profit. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil. The name alone was strategy. In an era where kerosene lamps regularly exploded and killed families, Standard was a promise. This won't blow up your house. But he didn't want a share of the market. He wanted the market itself. In 1872, he made his move, what history now calls the Cleveland Massacre. He secretly formed the South Improvement Company, a shadow alliance with the railroad kings, Vanderbilt and Scott. He offered them guaranteed, massive daily volume. In exchange, he demanded the rebate, a secret discount that let him ship oil at half the price of any competitor. Then came the truly cold-blooded part, the drawback. Rockefeller forced the railroads to take a cut of the fees his rivals paid to ship, and hand that money directly to him. His competitors were unknowingly funding their own destruction with every barrel they moved. Armed with this invisible weapon, Rockefeller began his house calls. He'd invite a rival refiner to his quiet, dim office. No shouting, no theatrics. He'd open his ledgers and show them the mathematics. I ship for 50 cents. You ship for $1. I collect a piece of your dollar, he'd say, with the calm of a man reading a weather report. You cannot win. Sell to me now at a fair price, or I will run you into the ground. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an autopsy on a living patient. In 4 months, 22 of his 26 competitors had been absorbed into Standard Oil. At 32 years old, Rockefeller had conquered Cleveland. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He was a sovereign. To John D. Rockefeller, 1 cent wasn't just money. It was a soldier. And losing a soldier through carelessness was a moral failing. The most famous example of this happened in a Standard Oil canning plant. Rockefeller stood watching in silence as a machine dropped molten solder onto kerosene can lids. Most bosses would have seen an efficient assembly line. Rockefeller saw a leak. How many drops of solder on each can? He asked. 40, sir. Try 38. They tried 38. The cans leaked. Most men would have stopped there. Not Rockefeller. Try 39. 39 held. One single drop of solder, saved across millions of cans, put $2,500 back in the company's pocket that first year. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money, squeezed from a microscopic adjustment no one else would have even thought to make. But efficiency was only half the formula. The other half was elimination. Rockefeller noticed he was paying too much for the barrels that held his oil. So instead of negotiating with barrel makers, he replaced them entirely. He bought thousands of acres of white oak forest. He built his own kilns. He manufactured his own iron hoops. He bought the horses and wagons that delivered the finished product. By the mid-1880s, Rockefeller didn't just own the oil. He owned the tree the barrel came from, the acid that refined it, the road it rolled down to your door. He had built a closed loop, a system where every dollar spent stayed inside the Standard Oil family. Competition wasn't just difficult in this world. It was structurally impossible. He hadn't built a company. He'd built a machine. And machines don't have bad days. In the 1860s, lighting a lamp was a gamble with your life. Most kerosene was badly refined, loaded with naphtha and gasoline, with a flash point low enough that a single flicker could turn your dining room into a debris field. Thousands of American homes burned. Families were scarred, killed, by the very light they'd bought to see by. People were terrified of the dark, but they were more terrified of the fuel. Rockefeller recognized this as a structural flaw and a massive opportunity. He hired the finest industrial chemists in the country to strip every impurity from Standard Oil's product. When a can carried the blue Standard Oil seal, it was a guarantee. This will not kill you. He turned a commodity into a brand, and the brand was built on safety. But while his competitors were satisfied with selling clean kerosene, Rockefeller was staring at what they threw away. Most refineries were environmental catastrophes. They dumped thick, foul-smelling sludge directly into rivers. Rockefeller looked at that sludge and saw a ledger entry in the wrong column. He set his chemists to work on it. They refined it into paraffin wax, for candles, for chewing gum. They turned it into Vaseline. They processed it into heavy lubricants for the very railroads that Rockefeller was simultaneously wrestling for control of. And then there was gasoline. In the 1870s, gasoline was considered worthless. Worse than worthless, it was dangerous, so explosive that Standard Oil plants secretly burned it off in massive pits under the cover of darkness, just to be rid of it. Even Rockefeller hated burning it. Willful waste made him woeful. He couldn't have possibly known that the garbage he was lighting on fire would one day power the internal combustion engine. That the nuisance byproduct he was destroying by the barrel load would eventually become the most valuable liquid on the planet. Sometimes, the greatest fortunes are built on what everyone else throws in the bin. By the late 1870s, the railroad kings had a problem. They'd made a deal with a monster, and the monster had outgrown them. Standard Oil wasn't just a customer anymore. It was a shadow authority dictating their schedules, bleeding their profits through rebates, and growing more untouchable by the month. In a rare moment of unity, the rival railroads formed a cartel and did the one thing Rockefeller couldn't stomach. They hiked his rates. The world waited for him to sue, to negotiate, to blink. Instead, Rockefeller decided to make the entire railroad industry irrelevant. He backed a project that engineers at the time called insane, the Tidewater Pipeline. The plan was to lay a 6-inch iron artery stretching from the Pennsylvania oil fields over the jagged frozen peaks of the Allegheny Mountains all the way to the Atlantic coast. The problem? Getting oil to move uphill at scale, at pressure. Nobody had done it. Many said the pipe would simply explode. The railroad kings didn't just laugh. They went to war. They refused to let the pipeline cross their tracks. They sent men, armed with clubs and torches, to beat construction crews and tear iron from the ground under cover of night. Local officials, freshly paid off, revoked permits and arrested workers. It was a literal battle for the infrastructure of America. Rockefeller poured millions in. He treated each setback as friction. Necessary friction. He knew that whoever controlled the delivery route controlled everything downstream. In 1879, the pumps roared to life. The oil began to move, slowly, just 2 miles per hour. But it moved. Uphill. Over the mountains. Without a single trained car. When that first barrel of oil reached the Atlantic coast under its own pressure, the railroad kings were finished. Their monopoly on transportation, the chokehold they'd tried to use against him, had been severed. By the 1880s, Rockefeller's pipelines carried 90% of the world's oil. He hadn't just beaten the railroads. He'd made geography itself irrelevant and replaced it with his own infrastructure. By the early 1880s, Rockefeller had a problem that most men would have envied. His empire was too big for the American legal map. In the 19th century, the United States wasn't really a unified market. It was a patchwork of jealous states, each with its own laws, and those laws were clear. A company in Ohio couldn't own stock in a company in Pennsylvania. State lines were barriers, frictions, and Rockefeller had built his entire philosophy around eliminating friction. So, he changed the definition of ownership. In 1882, in a quiet law office, his counsel Samuel Dodd drafted a document that would haunt American economics for the next century. They created the Standard Oil Trust. Here's how it worked. The shareholders of dozens of different companies didn't sell to Rockefeller. They quietly handed their stock to a board of 9 trustees, with Rockefeller at the head, and received trust certificates that paid out enormous profits in return. On paper, these were independent companies. In reality, they were the limbs of a single organism, controlled by a single brain. And because the trust wasn't technically a corporation, it didn't have to report earnings to anyone. It had no public address. It was a ghost empire, an invisible leviathan gliding through state lines like they were made of smoke. Rockefeller hadn't just broken the law. He'd floated above it, into a space where the law hadn't been written yet. 1,000 factories, pipelines, and offices across an entire continent now moved in perfect synchronization, responding to a single whisper from a desk in New York. The octopus had its nervous system. And somewhere in Washington, in the offices of men who were supposed to be the most powerful in the country, a slow and terrible realization was dawning. There was now a private entity more organized, more informed, and more powerful than the state itself. By 1897, John D. Rockefeller had achieved the ultimate dream of any engineer. He had made himself unnecessary. At 58, while rivals were bleeding from ulcers and fighting over table scraps of market share, Rockefeller quietly closed his ledger, put on his hat, and walked out of 26 Broadway. He retreated to Kykwit, his fortress-like estate above the Hudson River. And then, as far as the public was concerned, he disappeared. For the next 14 years, his name never left the newspapers. Protesters burned his effigy. Politicians built careers on promises to bring him to justice. Outrage followed outrage. But the man they were hunting was already somewhere else, obsessing over the drainage of his garden, agonizing over the slope of a fairway, playing golf. This is the part that people don't talk about enough, because it's the most remarkable thing he ever did. He hadn't just built a company. He'd built an autonomous intelligence. The men he'd left in charge, men like John D. Archbold, had been so thoroughly shaped by the Rockefeller method that they needed no instructions. They knew exactly how to squeeze a competitor, how to approach a senator, how to find that extra drop of solder without ever picking up the telephone. The machine fed itself. Meanwhile, at Kykwit, Rockefeller was earning millions of dollars a month in dividends, while he napped. He had solved the problem that breaks most wealthy men. He had completely disconnected his income from his time. He was no longer a businessman. He was a fixed point. The empire he'd built was running itself, crushing rivals on autopilot and vacuuming up the wealth of the world, while its creator pruned hedges and chipped golf balls in the Hudson Valley sun. While Rockefeller pruned his hedges, a storm was assembling itself in a cramped editorial office in New York. Its name was Ida Tarbell. She wasn't just a journalist. She was a witness with a long memory. Her father had been one of the independent oil men destroyed in the Cleveland Massacre. She had watched her community hollowed out, her father's business partner driven to suicide, and the system triumph through what she had always believed was cold-blooded theft. She didn't want a headline. She wanted an autopsy. For 5 years, Tarbell worked like a ghost inside the Standard Oil machine. She didn't traffic in rumors or emotional appeals. She used Rockefeller's own weapon against him, the ledger. She tracked down discarded former executives. She dug through courthouse basements to find buried transcripts, and eventually she found the smoking gun, physical evidence of the secret railroad rebates and the drawbacks, documented and irrefutable. Starting in 1902, she published The History of the Standard Oil Company across 19 consecutive issues of McClure's magazine, not one article, 19. A sustained, methodical demolition job, The public was riveted. For the first time, the invisible Leviathan was being mapped in black and white. Tarbell didn't just attack Rockefeller's tactics. She attacked his myth. She replaced the business genius with what she argued he actually was, a predator who had systematically poisoned the American dream to feed his machine. She noted with particular relish the irony that the man who taught Sunday school was the same man who strangled competitors in the dark. At Kikwit, the silence grew heavy. Advisors begged Rockefeller to sue, to respond, to fight back. He refused. He called her that poisonous woman in private. Miss Tarbell in company. He would not give her the dignity of a public rebuttal. But the world had changed. In the age of the muckrakers, silence no longer looked like dignity. It looked like an admission. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in America had been made to look small, and a woman with a notebook had done it. She had given the United States government something it had never possessed before: a map, a complete, documented roadmap to the destruction of Standard Oil. All Washington had to do was follow it. In 1906, the United States government stopped chasing a man and started chasing a ghost. The Department of Justice filed what would become the trial of the century, alleging that Standard Oil was not a business, but a conspiracy in restraint of trade. For 5 years, the word octopus hung in the air over Washington. Government lawyers used Tarbell's roadmap to argue that Rockefeller had corrupted the free market at its roots, that the game had been rigged before most of his competitors even knew they were playing. Standard Oil's lawyers countered with cold logic. They had brought light to the poor, lowered prices across the board, and built the most efficient organization in human history. Where was the harm in that? On May 15, 1911, exactly as Rockefeller was stepping onto that golf course, Chief Justice Edward White delivered a verdict that changed the world. He invented a new legal doctrine on the spot: the rule of reason. Standard Oil was an unreasonable monopoly. It had 6 months to dismantle itself. 34 companies, names that would define the next century. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil. Standard Oil of California, Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana, Amoco. The public erupted. The giant had been slain. But Rockefeller was already doing the math. Because he owned roughly 25% of the parent company, the breakup meant he suddenly owned 25% of all 34 offspring. And here's what no one had fully reckoned with. The true value of the trust's assets had been hidden for decades inside private ledgers. Now, forced into the sunlight of the public markets, the world discovered that Rockefeller's empire was worth vastly more than anyone had imagined. Then the final piece clicked into place. As horses gave way to automobiles, the nuisance byproduct that Standard Oil had been burning off in secret pits at night, gasoline, became the most valuable liquid on Earth. Demand exploded 10,000% almost overnight. The government had tried to punish Rockefeller. They had forced him to diversify his portfolio at the exact moment the greatest energy boom in human history began. He didn't just survive the breakup. He became the world's first confirmed billionaire because of it. Washington had aimed for an execution. They'd accidentally performed a coronation. In 1914, the Rockefeller system finally met the one variable it couldn't optimize: the human spirit. While the elder Rockefeller played golf in New York, his empire had spread into the coalfields of southern Colorado. At the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, the system had reached its most extreme dystopian conclusion. The miners didn't just work for Rockefeller. They were owned by him. They lived in company shacks. They bought food at company stores using company-issued scrip, fake currency, worthless outside the company's walls. They walked company streets patrolled by company guards. They were serfs in a private kingdom in 20th century America. When 11,000 miners finally walked out, demanding only the right to spend real money and live in homes they didn't rent from their boss. The machine didn't negotiate. It evicted them. Into the freezing rain. The family set up a tent colony near a place called Ludlow. For months, they held their ground against searchlights and machine gun fire from armored cars. Vehicles the workers had, with dark accuracy, nicknamed Death Specials. On the morning of April 20th, the National Guard, whose payroll was being subsidized by the Rockefellers, took up positions on the surrounding hills and opened fire. When the shooting stopped, they moved in with torches. The next morning, the world woke up to an image that couldn't be unseen. Beneath the charred ruins of tent number 1, rescue workers found a hand-dug pit. Inside, 11 children and 2 women who had crawled into the earth to escape the bullets and suffocated when the canvas above them caught fire. The backlash was tectonic. For the first time, Standard Oil efficiency looked like Standard Oil murder. Gunmen attacked company mines in a 10-day guerrilla war. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was hauled before Congress, where he sat rigid and robotic, insisting he had no knowledge of what was happening in his own company's facilities. The system was failing, and for the first time, the Rockefeller name itself was in danger. So they did what they'd always done when confronted with a problem they couldn't solve. They hired a specialist. His name was Ivy Lee, and his job was to invent modern public relations. The assignment wasn't to change the Rockefellers. It was to change the story of the Rockefellers. If you crossed paths with John D. Rockefeller in the 1920s, in New York, or on a Florida fairway, you'd have encountered a strange, skeletal old man who looked more like a medieval monk than the richest human being in history. This was the new Rockefeller, carefully designed, meticulously maintained. Under Ivy Lee's guidance, the man who had built his empire in the shadows was now a public performance of manufactured warmth. Everywhere he went, Rockefeller carried a pocket full of shining, uncirculated dimes. He pressed them into the hands of children, delivery men, startled strangers, even rival millionaires. A small gift, a bright piece of silver, a moment of human connection from a man who had spent 60 years treating humans as variables. It was psychological warfare in miniature. How do you hate a man who just gave your kid a coin? He was buying back his reputation 10 cents at a time. But behind the dimes, a much larger operation was running. Rockefeller didn't just donate to charity. He applied the Standard Oil method to human suffering itself, treating it as a waste product to be engineered out of existence. He funded the research that wiped out hookworm across the American South, a parasite that had kept millions in grinding, lethargic poverty for generations. He built the University of Chicago from a patch of empty land. He funded the medical board that standardized American doctors, effectively killing off the snake oil salesman. Men like, in a satisfying twist, his own father. He wasn't saving souls. He was optimizing the human race. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937. He was 97 years old, just weeks shy of 98. He had lived long enough to watch his gasoline power the world, his vaccines help save it, and his enemies, one by one, fade away. So was he the predator who crushed the American dream, or the architect who brought light, safety, and medicine to a chaotic, dangerous world? Maybe the most honest answer is that he was the system itself. He showed us that in a capitalist world, taken to its logical conclusion, the free market eventually ceases to exist, consumed by the most efficient player. He showed us that optimization is a blade with 2 edges. It can build civilizations, but it has no room for the souls living inside them. He once said, "I believe the power to make money is a gift from God. Whether that gift was a blessing or a curse, we are all right now still living inside the world that John D. Rockefeller built." If you want more stories about the people who rewired the modern world, subscribe.